Okay, welcome back everybody. All right, in this video we're going to be talking about households. Now, of course, everybody has heard that word before. We all have some idea what we know, or we think we know what a household is. Sorry, but in economics, we have a very particular meaning for that word, and it's also a unit of analysis. And so we want to understand in this video a few different things. Okay, first, we're going to talk about what a household is to economists, how we categorize sources of incomes to households. So we'll talk about in this video about how competitive markets determine incomes of all types. And we'll learn about signs of less than competitive markets. So markets, that is to say, how do we know when a market isn't really competitive? And then finally in this video we'll be talking about the regulations of those factor markets. Okay, factor markets are just the markets for things businesses use, as we've talked about in previous videos. So like land, labor, and capital. All right, hey there everybody. So to start off, what is a household, right? Okay, well, I'm sort of in a household right now. But when economists talk about a household and we look at data and we see household economic data, what we're referring to is individuals or a series of individuals that make joint consumption decisions. Okay, so what does that mean, joint consumption decisions? Well, it just means that we make decisions together about how to spend money. So, for example, maybe you live alone. Well, then your household is just you. Maybe you have a roommate, but you're not related at all, but you split the rent and you split the utilities. Well, you're making joint consumption decisions then, and you have a household of two. Maybe you live with your parents, right? So it's you and your parents, and you decide what kind of groceries to get and so on and so forth. Well, you make joint consumption decisions in your household of three. Okay, so households are made up of people who are related or not related, right? But that they sort of consume goods and services jointly. Okay, so that's what we mean when we say household. Now let's take a look at incomes. So to get started with, what we want to talk about is incomes and of households and the categories of those incomes. Now in this presentation, again, this is economics, so we're not really interested in the sociology of the household. We're not really interested in the psychology of households or anything like that, or why people choose to get married or not, or anything like that. That's really not our zone. What we're concerned with here is really two things. The first is how households receive income, and then two, how households choose to spend that income. All right, so starting with the first one of those, how do households receive income? There are different ways that households can earn incomes. Most households earn most of their income through labor, that is through wages. So we provide labor to the market, right, and we receive back a return for providing that labor, and that return is called a wage rate. Of course, there are other ways to earn income that maybe you hadn't thought of. For example, if I have a large amount of financial capital, and that is, say, money, right? I can let other people use that money, and I can earn interest, right? This is another form of income, and it's a payment on providing financial capital to the market. Okay, interest earned. Different types of households are going to want to spend differently, right? Some are going to want to spend today, and we call that desire consumption spending, while others are going to spend in the future, and we call that savings. Okay, and of course, different types of households are likely to have different types of preferences about how to spend. And when we look at households by demographic type, we're going to find very, very different sources of income and different ways in which they spend income. Let's talk about the sources then of income. As we mentioned, there's already wage income and there's interest income. Okay, wage income, of course, to reiterate, is a payment to labor. Right? So we provide labor to the market, we receive back the income of wages. When we provide financial capital to the market, we receive back interest earned. There is also, of course, rental income. Rental income is when we provide land or building facilities, right? Same idea to the market, and the return we earn is rental income. Then there is a fourth form of income called profit income, right? And it's this, if your taxes, right, includes like dividends, profits, other earnings like this. And this is a little complicated to explain. In competitive markets, there essentially shouldn't be any long-run profit income. There should only be profit income in the short run while markets adjust, right? So explaining persistent rates of profit greater than a sort of normal return on capital requires some non-competitive market thinking, which we will touch upon later in this video. Okay, so suffice it to say that profit income is somewhat more complicated than the other three. As I mentioned, an important part of all this discussion is the assumption that markets are competitive. Okay, so what does it mean that markets are competitive? Well, in short, it means that no one or even small group of suppliers or demanders can influence prices in the market. Okay, so like for example, if I go to the store today, I can't negotiate the price of potato chips down at the grocery store. Whatever's on the bag, that's what I'm going to pay. All right. Similarly, the grocery store can't negotiate the prices up. They try to argue like, well, we're going to make these potato chips, 20% more expensive. Well, I'm just going to go to the store next door and buy them at the market price. Okay. Now, when markets are competitive, so when nobody can influence, no one individual can influence the price, then the price of things equals its what we call in economics marginal value added. Okay. Whenever you hear the word marginal in economics, I want you to think additional, right? Because that's what we mean. Okay, so value added is exactly what it sounds like. How much value did I add to this item? So when we think about a competitive labor market, the wage rate that should be paid in a competitive labor market will be the marginal value added by labor. In other words, if I hire an additional laborer, how much value do they add to my production process? And then, that's what I end up having to pay them. It's not necessarily that I want to pay them that, but I have to pay them that. Here's why this explanation is problematic, because we know that in many labor markets, some groups of people are paid less or more than other groups for the same type of work. Okay, if these labor markets are competitive, then it implies that there's less marginal value added by some individuals than others. Okay. However, if those markets are less than competitive, then we have some other possible explanations, right? Okay, so the one that gets the most press, right, is male and female returns to labor or wage payments, right? And in most industries, we find that women earn less than men, right? So that is the sort of competitive explanation correct, that women create less value added? Well, probably not. Okay, so then, what else is there to explain it? Well, it would have to be less than a perfectly competitive market. It's just why. To start thinking about competitive or less than competitive labor markets, we would need to think about, first how a competitive market works. Now, a competitive, let's say that we have a competitive labor market for a second. So I know people are getting all worked up right now, but let's just say we have a hypothetically competitive labor market, and how's that going to work? How a competitive labor market works is that if you can imagine that you're going to work, right, and you're producing widgets, right, some generic item for sale, right? Let's say that in a given hour, you're able to produce 10 of those items, and then let's say that the market value of each of those is like 20, right? So basically you're producing 200 of final market output value in an hour. But of course, not all that value is created by you. Maybe let's say a quarter of that value was created by you as a worker, right? So if it wasn't for you, it would be worth less than 200. Maybe it'd only be worth 150. Okay, so then what we're saying is that in the last hour you created $50 worth of market value. All right, now why would a competitive labor market have to effectively pay you that for a wage? Well, let's imagine that you were only paid $25 or $30 an hour. Well, then the business down the street that's competing with the business that you're working with could easily offer to pay you $40 an hour, right? And make money every hour that you're working, right? Because you're producing $50 worth of value an hour. So again, if the market is competitive, they'll do that, right? And then similarly, your firm might say, well, geez, we didn't realize what we have. We'll pay you, $49.99 an hour, okay? Because you're creating $50 worth of value every hour, and that, as from a business perspective, that would make sense to do. And now some of you are saying, yeah, well, it kind of doesn't work that way. Yeah, that's right, because oftentimes labor markets aren't perfectly competitive. But to understand, to get a firm handle on what's not competitive, right, we need to first understand how competitive market works. And that's how competitive market works. What would make a market less than perfectly competitive? And what would make it the case that that process doesn't happen, and that we're able to negotiate prices a little bit, right? So there's some room for wiggle. This only occurs in less than perfectly competitive markets, right? And so if we think about, some of you might think, well, a lot of markets there's negotiation and wiggle. Well, yeah, that's right, because a lot of markets are less than perfectly competitive. Okay, so let's think about what happens, in those cases. Well, let's say let's back away from a labor market for a second and just think about some generic item that you're selling, maybe on, eBay or some other online forum or Craigslist, or even just in a yard sale. The buyer comes up and they try to offer you a lower price, and you're not sure about that lower price. You'd like to negotiate it up a little bit. Okay, well, when you're trying to negotiate a price up, what are you going to start doing? Well, you're going to start revealing attributes of the product that maybe the person didn't know it had. So you might say, well, this item is yellow, and there's only a handful of these are yellow, and you clearly like the yellow, so you're not going to find another one of these. Okay, so you're trying to convey additional value in the product, right? Or you might say, well, look, this there's only a handful of these, and people want these, and so if you don't want it, I'm just not going to sell it to you, and I'm going to keep the price higher. So you can attempt to be essentially a monopolist and withhold from the market to drive prices up. But sometimes people will give the product false attributes, right? New and improved, even better than before, in attempt to try to drive its price up, try to attempt to drive its perceived value added up, right? Conversely, on the other side of the market, right, if you're on the buyer side of the market, you're trying to bring prices down, and so what you start doing is you start talking down the attributes of the product. Oh, well, yeah, it's yellow, but yeah, the yellow's kind of ugly anyway, and really wanted a red one or whatever. Okay, right? These are signs of less than competitive markets. So when you see these things, right, then it suggests that the market is less than competitive. Okay. Other things that you're going to notice, when markets are less than perfectly competitive, is that the same thing sells for different prices, right? So you might have this item in this location sells for this price, but then in a nearby location, it sells for a very different price. So it suggests that that market is imperfect, right? And maybe that folks just aren't aware of the other place where they can buy it, and that's why prices are different. Right, and so that's what we call information failure, and it's another sign of a market that's less than perfect. Prices could be higher or could be lower, depending upon where the market power resides. If market power resides with sellers, then the price will be higher, and if the price resides with buyers, then the price will be lower. Okay, so now we know what competitive markets are. We know what the signs of less than competitive markets are. So then, how do we correct that? Right? How do we correct it? A less than competitive market, because we know that competitive markets essentially give what's deserved, but non-competitive markets don't necessarily do that. So how do we correct that? Well, generally speaking, regulatory solutions are imperfect, right? The first thing is to recognize the nature of the problem, okay? And we do that by understanding how outcomes are deviating from what a competitive result would produce. Okay, which is why we absolutely have to know what the competitive result would produce, because it's the benchmark against which we're going to judge a lack of competition. So once we've figured out what a competitive market would produce, right, and then we're looking at how the results differ from that, what we can do is start creating regulatory structures that mimic what the result would have been if it had been a competitive market. Okay, so to give an example, let's say we find that a given labor market is producing wages that are 10% less than what we believe a competitive market would produce. Okay, well, what to do? Well, the first thing you could do, it would be the obvious solution, and just demand direct compensation. So demand that buyers of labor fully compensate sellers of labor for the 10% that they'd been misled in some way, shape, or form out of. Other possibilities would be to simply create a price floor at what we believe the competitive price would look like. That might be a minimum wage, okay, which is just a price floor, right? It's a minimum that you can charge in a market. We could require other forms of compensation to bring that up, so things like healthcare, paid days off, so on and so forth. We could require full disclosure, right? So there's a reason why the market is failing. Maybe it's bad. Maybe it's just bad information, right? And if it's just bad information, then we can require a disclosure of all that information, so that people know what the story is. It may be that people are sort of over a barrel. Maybe there's only one place they can sell their labor, or just a handful of places they can sell their labor, and so the wages are lower. Well, we could encourage then entrepreneurship within the area by providing additional sources of capital to people, okay, to create more firms essentially, and create a more competitive market for labor within a specific geography. Okay. There are a variety of solutions, and the solutions are largely dependent upon the nature of the market failure, or the specific reasons why the market is not very competitive. Right? In the United States, this has been the general approach of regulatory agencies, is to try to figure out what the market would look like if it were competitive, and then to in a sort of reverse engineering way to create a legal structure such that it causes non-competitive markets to replicate the outcomes that would have occurred in competitive markets. Okay, so that's where we're going to leave it for this part. In the second part, we're going to pick it up with these other items over there. Okay, thanks very much, everybody. Have a good time. We'll see you next time.